Okay, I've got some brand new findings about the links between shoes, specifically tight shoes, and bunions. And not just super pointy shoes, but shoes that are just kind of like just a medium, kind of what we consider like a normal, like regular toe box, slightly tapered toe boxes, as well as more anatomic or wide shaped toe boxes. And this gets so weird. I just about guarantee you you cannot guess where this video is going. Because even me, the person who does this for a living, that was reading it all and distilling it all for this video, even I had to do a bunch of double takes on this stuff. Even I'm thinking like, am I going crazy? And while yeah, maybe looking at all these shoes has made me crazy, I will say that the level of detail now we're getting in the research in terms of bunions and shoes is so much better than we used to have in terms of just, hey, do high heels cause bunions, right? Do super constrictive shoes with a super high heel cause a bunion? Or do shoes with a super unforgiving pointed tip, like a dress shoe, cause bunions? We're getting such better information about different types of shoes, different types of people, and different types of situations that finally, like, our recommendations are starting to match up to all the diversity of shoes and diversity of wear and diversity of risk. Because yes, there are people out there in the audience that, yes, there are big risk factors for you that you need to consider, and I will get to in this video. And there's other people where the risks are much more nuanced. So at the end of the video, I will give you my recommendations, and I will give you who I think is at the most risk and what my recommendations for shoes are for kind of each risk category. So by the end of the video, you should have a really good understanding of what your risk is and should you be changing your shoe buying habits. So let's get into it. So before I get into the actual findings, and I will right after this, I think I just have to spend a few seconds talking about what weight different words have in the medical community. And in this instance, it's the difference between the word causative and the word aggravate. Causative is considered something that is literally the root cause of something, right? As in anything else can make it worse or better or change the course of an issue. An aggravative factor is one that, if you're predisposed to the condition, has the potential to make it worse, but on its own won't cause the deformity to begin. And the reason I bring that up is that we just got a new clinical consensus guideline for hallux valgus, which is the technical name for a bunion. And this goes all the way from surgery to causative factors, conservative care, really everything in between. And these clinical reference guidelines, I mean, they're not gospel, they're just pieces of research, but they do at least, or they're supposed to, reflect the current science behind a current topic and what just, best practices are for a certain condition. And this most recent guideline on hallux valgus, or bunions, has now downgraded shoes from a causative factor for bunions to just an aggravative factor for bunions. And this was not just done based on a whim, it was done based on some of the largest studies of foot anatomy ever done. And it comes really decades after similar studies, studies of similar sizes done on bunions. And so this bunion guide comes out after all this research and basically is saying shoes are a factor in bunion progression, but not a predictive factor. But why? Were all these people in the pockets of, big shoe? No, it is much, much more interesting than that. Now, all a bunion is this bone here, the first metatarsal, one of the bones makes up the ball of your foot, drifting inside or medially. And then what happens is, as it drifts medially, you get what's called reverse buckling here of the big toe joint, and that big toe starts to move in. Now you see the bunion up here at the first MPJ, metatarsal phalangeal joint, but the apex of it is actually back here at the first TMTJ, or first tarsometatarsal joint. And that's why the most successful surgeries for bunions focus on pushing this bone back in and fusing the joint back here, and then allowing this joint to realign. But the more important thing about bunions that most people don't realize is that bunions happen in 3 planes. It's not just that the big toe shifts over like this. It's not that simple. There's also a rotational component to them where this bone twists, as well as a sagging component to it where that bone actually starts drifting upwards. Now, the overall presence of bunions globally is 19% of people, with it being present in 23.7% of females and 11.4% of males. The first confirmed preserved limb with skin intact we have found with a bunion goes all the way back to 2100 BC in ancient Egypt, where thanks to them mummifying their dead, scientists were able to definitively classify a cadaver human with this versus just assembling bones from skeletons and making assumptions based on incomplete anatomy. And since 2100 BC, obviously bunions have been present in society, but in the 1960s, there was a huge study done on a single island population where 54% of people were barefoot most of the time and the others were shoe wearing. And this study was widely referred to as the Shine Study. Now they found that hallux valgus was absent in some families who wore shoes and present in others who did not, indicating, at least he said, that shoes weren't always a cause and that hereditary or other factors were at play. But Shine also found that shoe wearing was the only statistically significant predictor of bunions, controlling for every other measurable, like social and physical variable in both men and women. Everything else, like body weight, what they did for a living, exercise, or social class, it was tested and failed to reach any significance. The only thing was shoes. But what was called out in his study, actually by Shine himself, was that the shoes on the island were of terrible quality and in only limited sizing. So most of the people in this study were wearing not just maybe like not ideal shoes, but straight up harmful, misaligned shoes, being in sizes that were not made for them, and with materials which could have constricted the foot in, lots of weird ways, not just with bunions. But the main findings of his study were that after more than 60 years of shoe wearing, 48% of women had true hallux valgus. Only 16% of men, though, did after that same duration. So it took 60 years of wearing shoes akin to a torture device to reach the angle of deformity necessary to classify their foot as having a bunion. Now that was a landmark study because although there were some contradictory findings, there was a clear trend of shoe wearing, and the longer you wear shoes, with the more chance that you would get a bunion. Now, fast forward to the mid-2000s, where in 2016, a doctor by the name of Menz looked at people wearing very narrow shoes, which is like akin to a high heel. A narrow shoe, akin to like a tapered athletic shoe or a typical tapered casual shoe. Wide shoes, akin to like a Brooks, Hoka, or Saucony, and very wide shoes, akin to like an Ultra type shoe with an anatomic toe box. And they found if every woman who wore a wide, narrow, or very narrow toe box shoe between the ages of 20 and 29 had instead wore what the study classified as a very wide toe box, approximately 18 out of every 100 cases of bunions in older women may have been prevented. If women wearing very narrow or narrow toe box shoes between the ages of 20 and 29 had shifted to just a wide or very wide toe box, 7 out of every 100 cases may have been prevented. Now this study kind of downplays, right, how many bunions can be prevented by widening the toe box. But it does show a clear correlation with how narrow the toe box is and how much risk there is. So even though it was, small risk, it still was linear. Except in 2025, this all gets thrown out the window again because there was another study done on the shape and width of people's shoes' toe boxes. And they found that the width and overall area of the toe box made no difference in how much pressure was exerted on the metatarsal head, which is where the bunion forms, when people walked. The caveat to this was that all these people already had moderate to severe hallux valgus. So at that point, the deformity is kind of becoming rigid. The most interesting thing though about this study is they found that in the majority of shoes they measured in people with these bunions, that there was actually adequate room for the toes and midfoot. They used 3D modeling to determine this. They didn't just look at the shoe or take a picture or take people's word for it. And what the conclusion there was is that, and these were all commercially available shoes, is that most people's shoes have more room in them than what is thought of. And so we'll get to this later in the video, but basically a lot of the conclusion of that study is that shoes have more room in them than they look from the outside. But around the same time this study was being done, in Japan, they were working on a population-based study to try and finally clarify the presence of hallux valgus and investigate the associated risk factors. This study was referred to as the HAPPY study, the Hallux Valgus and Pain Epidemiology Study. Now, this study ran for 3 years and showed that the nationwide occurrence of bunions was 23.5%, 13.3% in men, 31.6% in women. And like other studies, it found a linear increase in the occurrence of bunions as the population got older. And what was absolutely just wild about that study is that it just contradicted all these other high-level studies. So this study showed that the height of the shoe's heel was the only significant association in terms of shoes and bunions, not toe box width. If you remember that men's study I talked about, he found that the heel height had no association with bunion deformity while the toe box did. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't an association between tight shoes and bunions, but it didn't meet statistical significance like wearing a shoe with a higher heel did. Remember, this study was enormous. It was a population study done. And while they did find a significant association with heel height and bunions, it did not find a significant association with toe box width and bunions. And so that actually brings us to this year in the Stat Pearls guidelines on hallux valgus, which only show shoes to be an aggravating factor, not causative. So do I agree with this classification or not? Well, since we are all being very technical and choosing our words very carefully, I would say my answer, do I agree with the Stat Pearls guideline? I would say no. If I was the one writing this guide, I would classify tight shoes as a mild risk factor for all, a causative factor in susceptible populations, mainly women in their 20s, and an aggravating factor for anybody with a family history of bunions. Because if you look at the research as a whole, it clearly points to a progression and acceleration of bunion deformity with shoe wear over time. It's just that it's so mild, and in most cases, the research has clearly shown that even people who wear no shoes can develop bunions, and people who wear the worst shoes possible sometimes don't get them. So it can't be the cause for all bunions. The research also shows that the incidence of bunions is largely in shoed populations or shod populations over the course of human history. The problem is that if you look at early shoes, especially like in Europe, like more medieval times, they were so pointed and unforgiving. What we have today is nothing like what people were jamming their feet into back then. Even just a couple decades ago, when people were mainly in, right, like dress shoes a lot of the time, those were so much worse for you than the casual shoes we have now, even if just in the uppers to allow more expansion of your foot. So even though some people might see some of these shoes and think, oh, they're pointed, they're tapered, it is still worlds better than what people used to put their feet in, you know, for the majority of the day a couple decades ago. And if you dig further into the numbers, you'll also notice another thing. The highest risk category is women in their 20s, which has historically been part of prime childbearing years. When women give birth, whether naturally or by cesarean section, they release a hormone called relaxin, which can cause loose ligaments and joint subluxation, especially in the foot because of gravity and weight bearing. So this is also the group at most risk for bunions just in general because of this factor. So if you have to take that into account, if you get a group of women being studied in these papers, right, who wear high heels, who are also producing this hormone, then yeah, the anatomy of a high heel or just a pointed shoe with maybe more of an open midfoot is basically a bunion making machine. And over and over and over again, these studies say the 20s are the riskiest decade for bunion formation. So it's hard to ignore that population's inherent risk when kind of looking at all of these papers. I can't see classifying tight shoes as either causative or aggravative because they clearly cause some bunions, just not all. And for most people, yeah, the risk is relatively mild. And I choose the word mild very carefully because this channel looks mostly at performance and casual shoes, which mostly have relatively compliant upper materials, save for that one, which allow more expansion of the foot, and relatively large footbeds compared to dress shoes for men or women and high heels. But these studies lump all sorts of shoes in. It seems like even though the shape of most performance and casual shoes isn't ideal completely, the risk is still low. Okay, but what are the practical takeaways to this? So say you like more tapered athletic shoes for whatever reason, the look, the feel, the fact that most are like still being made that way, you know, whatever. By my napkin math, it seems like you will increase your risk of a bunion by about 5 to 10%. If you can live with that risk, then, I don't know, forget you watch this video, I guess. But if you are concerned about your risk, what can you do to lower your risk? I'd say the best thing you can do is see if you can find anyone down the line in your family that's had bunions. If so, or if you have hypermobility in your midfoot, if you've got sagging ligaments in your midfoot, Maybe stay away from shoes that look like arrows for your daily driver and go with something like an Ultra for everyday wear. And then, wear what you want within reason as long as it's not overly pointy for sports. If you're running, yeah, Ultra is great if you want an anatomic shoe, but sometimes they can be a little bit torsally unstable. So you may want to go with something like a New Balance Wide Width or Brooks or Hoka. They're pretty much the most generously lasted shoes in terms of daily trainers. In terms of court sports, New Balance is the easiest recommendation. Unfortunately, right now, we've yet to consistently get a company making secure, stable, anatomic toe box shoes with the key features of a traditional shoe. And for anybody already dealing with a bunion, really no shoe alone is going to fix a triplanar structural deformity. But making sure that your footwear is not actively accelerating it is really still worth considering. The guidelines call shoes aggravative, and technically they are right for most people most of the time, but medicine has to speak in population averages, and you are not average. You are a specific person with a specific risk profile. I think that's why the new guidelines are softer on shoes, because the research is so all over the place, you can't just draw a black and white conclusion. Plus, in medicine, the burden of proof is so high. You can't just look at a few people or go based on a trust me bro type statement to make medical recommendations. You have to have real numbers to back up your stance. And so even though there are cases where people's bunions were a result of wearing a certain shoe, it's just not that for everybody. And I think that's why the recommendations need to be a little bit more tailored toward different people, because there are people out there where, yeah, the risk is just so minuscule. And there are other people where the risk is relatively high. And so you know who you are, after watching this video, and find shoes based on that. So like I said, love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you do want to see something that we've now proven is a clear benefit of anatomic and wide toe box shoes, something that has changed for, I'd say, the better in terms of recommending these shoes, make sure you click into this video right here. And if you want to see what the research shows on zero and low drop shoes versus traditional drop shoes, make sure you click into this video right here. I'll see you in the next video.